The Life of Dwight L. Moody by his son, Chapter 2, being read by Peter John Paresis, also known as Brian Dean. The audios are not copyrighted. Please feel free to make as many copies as you desire. Chapter 2, Leaving Home. It was an early characteristic of Moody that his determination to accomplish his purpose was not easily dwarfed. On one occasion, he wished to visit his grandmother Holton, who lived about 4 miles away. The little man was scarce 5 years of age, and so long a journey seemed even greater than many times that distance to an older child. Someone had given him 5 cents, but this was only half the required amount for a child's stage fare for this distance. Nothing daunting, however, little Dwight stopped the passing stage, and having stated his case to the driver, asked if he would accept the 5 cents for his fare. The stage was already full inside, but the stage driver consented to take him as baggage, and for 5 cents placed him on top of the coach within the rack that guarded the trunks. He reached his grandmother's, the only other house in the world where the Moody children were assured of a welcome, and after spending a day at the old farm, was urged by his relatives to make an early start for home, as it was supposed that he intended to walk back to Northfield. The little fellow had made up his mind, however, that the stagecoach was far preferable to a long tramp, and had already made his plans for riding home. Going out into the fields, he picked a bouquet of wildflowers, another of caraway, and once more hailed the coach, pre-offering his flowers for his return journey. We can imagine the surprise of his mother at seeing Dwight returning in triumph, perched upon the stage box. It was this spirit which made him a leader among the boys in his native town, and the wild escapades into which he led his companions were the source of amusing reminiscence in years later. Squire Alexander, from the fact that his was the nearest residence to the old red schoolhouse of that district, was most frequently the victim of those pranks. Stories are told how Dwight and his companions would appropriate the squire's old pug to coast down the steep hill below his house, the recklessness of the venture only adding the greatest zest to its enjoyment. On another occasion, he led his followers to the cattle sheds of the squire, where they quietly climbed up on the empty rafters, and then, of a sudden, raised the most awful whoops and yells, at the same time jumping about on the loose planks. The effect of this turmoil upon a lot of young steers may be well better imagined than described. The rush of the animals through the barnyard fences gave the youngsters occupation suited exactly to their taste. Of course, no one knew who was to blame for the stampede, for before the squire could reach the barn, there were no boys in sight, and in the roundup of the cattle, young Dwight was the most indignant at the inexcusable vandalism of the act. The closing exercises in the district school was an event of great local importance to the younger element, and Dwight was not the boy to let pass such an opportunity for some unusual excitement. On one such occasion, he was to give as a recitation Mark Antony's oration over Julius Caesar, and to add, as was supposed, to the dramatic effect, introduce the small box to represent the coffin of the illustrated dead. The teacher's desk served as a bier upon which this rested, and as the eloquence of the orator found added expression to the extravagant gestures, the little box was knocked off, and out jumped a very frightened old tomcat. The scene which followed had just the effect Mark Antony seemed to have aimed at, for though the stones of Rome did not rise, every animate being in the room did. Even simpler tricks delighted him. Once, when asked to hand a jug of cider to a farmer in his wagon, Dwight, who was then working on the farm, intending, indeed, to go home in that very wagon, waited only till the jug was at the farmer's lips to startle the horses so that their sudden jump unseated the driver, who fell back into the bottom of the wagon, unable to rise and equally unwilling to relinquish the jug, which would have drenched him had he taken it from his lips. Dwight's busy hand and brain were always occupied, and he wanted to see others busy too. In those younger days, he seemed to love the excitement of a crowd, and once, when an unusually uneventful winter had dragged by, he decided that something must be done. This he arranged without conference with anyone, not daring to trust his closest friends. Writing out an announcement for a temperance meeting to be addressed by an out-of-town lecturer, he posted it on the district schoolhouse door. On the evening announced, there was quite a gathering in the schoolhouse, which was warmed and lighted for the occasion, but no lecturer put in an appearance, and Dwight, with the others, scolded the practical joker, whom no one could discover. For such mischief, he frequently received a double chastisement, first at the hands of the schoolteacher, and afterwards from his mother. For according to the strange reasoning of that day, it was thought that if the boy was so naughty in school as to be punished, the same offense called loudly upon the mother also not to spare the rod and spoil the child. But evidently Dwight thought the fun was worth the whipping, for his love of practical jokes never grew less. It should be said, however, that when the joke was at his own expense, he enjoyed it just as much, for as he expressed it, no man has a right to play a joke unless he is willing to take one. A new teacher came at last to the little school, and another order of things appeared. To begin with, she opened the exercises with prayer, which greatly impressed the boys, and when later she announced that she proposed to rule the school without the old-fashioned whippings, their astonishment was increased. It was not long before young Dwight had broken a rule, and with a solemn summons to remain after school, he expressed the customary punishment and immediately assumed the attitude of injured innocence. To his surprise, when they were alone, the teacher began to talk kindly to him and to tell him how sorry she was to have him disobey. This treatment was worse than the rattan cane, and Dwight did not like it. After telling him how it grieved her to find that he could not be trusted, the teacher said, "I have made up my mind that if I cannot rule the school by love, I will give it up. I will have no punishment. If you love me, try to keep the rules and help me in the school." This was too much for Dwight, and where law had failed, grace had a complete victory. "You will never have any more trouble with me," he answered, calculating, "and I will whack the first boy that makes you any trouble." And whack him he did the very next day, to the surprise of his companions and to the consternation of the teacher. Swapping is a Yankee weakness, and in common with other boys, Dwight was keen on a bargain. Sentiment in those youthful days was less pronounced than the love of trade, for he bought off with a broken slate pencil the affections of a rival suitor for a little companion. But it was more easily to shrewdness in horse trading than Dwight aspired, and at the earliest opportunity he earned his titles for it. The older boy, George, who had fathered the younger children and conducted the farm, was away from home one day when a party of gypsies came along. As usual, they had a number of horses to trade, and Dwight, who was only 10 years of age at the time, was alive to business. The farm horse in the possession of the family at this time was old and lazy enough, and Dwight reasoned that in exchange he couldn't get a worse animal, so he challenged the gypsies to a trade. Before any of the family knew it, he had made what actually proved to be a good bargain, though the new horse was a lank, raw-boned animal with a docked tail. The consciousness of his success filled him with pride. On the first occasion after the new horse had been duly tested, Dwight harnessed him into a wagon, and taking an empty barrel for a seat, started to the mill for the weekly supply of meal. The new horse seemed to rise to the occasion. He started briskly down the hill and not too swiftly around the corner, leaving the barrel and its occupant by the roadside. When Dwight grew older, he found employment like his brothers in neighboring towns. His first experience was never forgotten, and the homesickness that came with the first separation from his family left a lasting impression. "There were 9 of us children," he said in describing this, and my widowed mother had very great difficulty in keeping the wolf from the door. My next older brother had found a place for me to work during the winter months in a neighboring village about 13 miles away, and early one November morning we started out together on our dismal journey. Do you know, November has been a dreary month to me ever since. As we passed over the river and up the opposite side of the valley, we turned to look back for the last view of home. It was to be my last 4 weeks, for months, perhaps forever, and my heart well nigh broke at the thought. That was the longest journey I ever took. The 13 miles was more to me at 10 than the world's circumference has ever been since. When at last we arrived in town, I had hard work to keep back my tears, and my brother had to do his best to cheer me. Suddenly he pointed to someone and said, "There's a man that'll give you a cent. He gives one to every new boy that comes to town." He was a feeble, old, white-haired man, and I was so afraid that he would pass me by that I planted myself directly in his path. As he came up to us, my brother spoke to him, and he stopped and looked at me. "Why, I have never seen you before. You must be a new boy," he said. He asked me about my home, and then, laying his trembling hand upon my head, he told me that although I had no earthly father, my heavenly Father loved me, and then he gave me a bright new cent. I do not remember what became of that cent, but that old man's blessing has followed me for over 50 years, and to my dying day I shall feel the kindly pressure of that hand upon my head. A loving deed costs very little, but done in the name of Christ, it will be eternal. A few years later, he tried to get employment in Clinton, Massachusetts, and found an engagement in a printing establishment. His first task was to address by hand from the mailing list the wrappers of a local paper. To the country lad who knew nothing of crowded streets or houses containing several tenements, the half-numbers of some of the addresses had no meaning, and such a street address he set down to the next number beyond. This naturally caused confusion, and when the mistake was traced to young Moody, he was discharged. Again he went home, and for a time worked on the neighboring farms. But his ambition had been aroused, and he soon realized the greater possibilities and opportunities of a larger sphere. While cutting and hauling logs on the mountainside with his brother Edwin one day in the early spring of 1854, he exclaimed in his characteristically abrupt manner, "I am tired of this. I am not going to stay around here any longer. I am going to the city." The family had been strongly opposed to his going to Boston, as no one believed that he had any special qualification for a successful career in the city. The cities, they understood, were full of young men looking for positions, while at Northfield he was at least assured of steady work on the farms. The young Moody had made up his mind that the one thing for him to do was to go to Boston and, in spite of all obstacles, make a career for himself. Saying goodbye to his mother and the rest of the family, he started from home without any very definite plans as to how he should get to Boston, but determined to go even if he had to walk every step of 100 miles. Halfway between his home and the depot, he met his older brother George, who inquired where he was going. Dwight said he was on his way to Boston to make his living in whatever business he found he was best suited for. Seeing that it was useless to try to discourage him, his brother gave him $5, which was just enough to carry him to the city, where he arrived with nothing to live on while he was looking for work. For several days, young Moody experienced the same bitter disappointment that so many other young men have known in like circumstances. Although he had two uncles in the retail boot and shoe business in the city, they made no offer to give him work. When asked by these uncles how he thought he could get a start, Dwight replied that he wanted to work, and he guessed he could find a position. It was quite possible that a consciousness of his awkwardness may have given the country boy that appearance of a false independency which prejudiced his relatives against him. Long afterwards, when preaching in Boston, he described with deep feelings those days of sufferings. "I remember I walked up and down the streets trying to find a situation," he said, "and I recollect how, when they answered me roughly, their treatment would chill my soul. But when someone would say, 'I feel for you. I would like to help you, but I can't. But you'll be all right soon,' I went away happy and light-hearted. That man's sympathy did me good. It seemed as if there was room for everyone else in the world, but none for me. For about 2 days I had the feeling that no one wanted me. I never have had it since, and I never want it again. It is an awful feeling. It seems to me that must have been the feeling of the Son of God when he was down here. They did not want him. He had come to save men, and they did not want to be saved. He had come to lift men up, and they did not want to be lifted up. There is no room for him in this world, and there is no room for him yet. I went to the post office 2 or 3 times a day to see if there was a letter for me. I knew there was not, as there was but one mail a day from Northfield. I had no employment and was very homesick, and so I went constantly to the post office, thinking perhaps that when the mail had come in my letter had been mislaid. At last, however, I got a letter. It was from my youngest sister, the first letter she ever wrote me. I opened it with a light heart, thinking there was some good news from home, but the burden of the whole letter was that she had heard there were pickpockets in Boston, and warned me to beware of them. I thought that I had better get some money in hand first, and then I might look out for pickpockets. At the end of the week, he was utterly discouraged. There seemed nothing for him in Boston, and he announced his purpose of trying what he could do in New York. At first, his attitude towards his uncles had been the independent one of waiting for them to offer him work, and when advised to ask them for employment himself, he said, "They know I am looking for work, and they may help me or not as they please." But at length his pride gave way under the dreadful sense of being adrift in a world that seemed to care nothing for him. Learning of his changed state of mind, one of his uncles ventured to offer him a little advice, telling him that his self-will was greatly in his way, that modesty was sometimes as needful as courage, and suggesting that his uncle Samuel Holton would no doubt be glad to do something for him if he would show himself a little more willing to be governed by people who were older and wiser than himself. Dwight demurred, saying his uncle Samuel knew perfectly well what he wanted, but the uncle insisted, so that at last the boy asked for a place in the shoe shop. "Dwight, I am afraid you come in here. If you come in here, you will want to run the store yourself," said Mr. Holton. "Now, my men here want to do their work as I want it done. If you want to come in here and do the best you can, and do it right, and if you're willing to ask whenever you don't know, and if you promise to go to church and Sunday school, and if you will not go anywhere that you wouldn't want your mother to know about, we'll see how we can get along. You can have till Monday to think it over." "I don't want to wait till Monday," was the prompt response. "I'll promise now." Young Moody had little acquaintance with city ways and city manners, but it soon became evident that he was by nature, wit, and brightness one of the best of salesmen. With his keen perception and irrepressible energy, he made an unusual success of the work. He was not satisfied with the ordinary methods of the salesman, and like the merchants of old, he cried his wares before the door, and actually went out to the street to persuade uninterested passers that they wanted to buy. Nothing delighted him so much as a success of this kind, and that he had many is not surprising. His new occupation, far from lessening his love of practical joking, seemed to make it better. Always on the lookout for someone whom he could tease, he found a tempting victim in a cobbler who worked in the store. One day in his absence, young Moody, with a sharp knife, made a clean slit in the leather seat of the cobbler's box. Then, taking a pan of water, he set it under the box so that the cobbler's weight would bring the seat in contact with the water, which of course would rise through the cut. Having set his trap, the joker awaited the result. Presently the cobbler came in and sat down. The effect may be imagined. The victim took his seat only to jump up hurriedly, but as soon as the leather was relieved of his weight, the hole closed, and after wiping the seat dry, he again seated himself to begin to work. It was not till the 3rd or 4th time that he discovered the trouble, and Moody had to make a hurried escape. This was the nonsense of a lively boy of 17, but from that harmless love of fooling, the happy gentility of a mature man was to results. This sense of humor, this healthy appreciation of the ridiculous, is the very salt of a great temperament. Such a man, however intense, can never be a fanatic, and the people, the men in the street, felt this instantly.